Hello, this is a quick lecture on the context in Dracula, following on from Miss Parks's excellent presentation on the context in the Bloody Chamber. I think this is really important because 50% of your answer on the comparative Gothic question will be related to how you use contexts. So you need to be able to go into that exam with a range of contexts in your pocket and being able to use them to explain the text. Okay, let's start by considering the writer's context. Stoker is an Irish Protestant, so in that he aligns himself with the British Empire and the values of Britain rather than particularly the values of Ireland, but he is influenced by the Celtic tales of vampires and the Gothic tales that would have been permeated through the Irish island. Remember, he worked as a newspaper journalist. He worked with Sheridan Le Fanu, I don't even know if I pronounced that right, who wrote Carmilla. And so think about where we might see the influence of a female vampire in the book. Poe is writing in the Gothic tradition. He's influenced by Poe, particularly the idea of the terror of the mind, and set in works within a urban Gothic city setting. Think about how this influence can be seen in Dracula in specific places. The novel uses the epistolary style. This novel in the form of journals or letters or diaries is quite common. They were the earliest form of novels to be written in letter form, and he takes that letter form obviously in the novel. Consider why he uses the epistolary style. Why do we have different people's letters and journals in this book? What does it add to the book? Does it add any sense of authenticity and therefore raises the level of terror because we feel that this is true? He travelled extensively in America. We have an American character in the book, which is unusual perhaps. Maybe he's got an eye on the American market. I suppose it's worth remembering that Stoker was a journalist. He worked on the Daily Telegraph, and this adds to the authenticity of the newspaper articles that are contained within the book. And consider how, because they are so authentically written, they add to this sense of verisimilitude, of accuracy, of this being an actual event, and so therefore raising the terror of the novel, which is one of the aims of a Gothic novel, to instill terror in the reader. Bram Stoker was influenced by different people he met, particularly Henry Irving, with whom he worked for 20 years. We'll talk about that a little later. But he also met a Hungarian writer, Armin van Buury, and perhaps from this emerged the ideas of dark stories from the Carpathian Mountains that he heard from Van Buury, and maybe this influenced his writing of Dracula. Remember, Dracula never went anywhere near Carpathia or Transylvania, and there's a famous book of Bran Castle and illustrations by Stoker in the British Library. But he spent several years researching European folklore and mythological stories of vampires. Consider how that research shows itself in the opening chapters of the book. Stoker was an intensely private man who had passionate relationships with other men. Whether they were sexual or not was speculative, but Walt Whitman, Henry Irving, and Hall Caine were amongst them. He was a friend of Oscar Wilde. I think it's interesting that he started writing the novel just weeks after the conviction of Wilde. Was he possibly fearful of what happened to Wilde? Was he inspired by the monstrous image and threat of otherness personified by Wilde? That the press coverage of Wilde kind of portrayed Wilde as almost this kind of monster figure. Did this inspire in some way this homoerotic monster figure in Dracula? In 1912, he demanded imprisonment of homosexual authors. Was this self-loathing or to disguise his own vulnerability in that area? We don't really know, but it's interesting that you can tease out sort of snippets of one's life with specific examples in the book. So you might wish to explore the homoerotic nature of Dracula with Harker, perhaps, or this monstrous outsider bringing a sexual threat to innocent British people, and maybe find links between Wilde and Dracula. So now take 10 minutes to consider the biographical context that we've explored and see where and write down some specific illustrative examples of where we might find these in the book, remembering that contexts are used to explain what we find in the book. Perhaps the most rewarding of context is the literary context, how this book is both influenced by other works of literature or how it responds or reacts to other works of literature. So in many ways, this is a Gothic novel, and we've explored Gothic novels to death, but you can see similarities with Dorian Gray, Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein, and the themes that are explored in early Gothic novels reoccur in Dracula. We see also in this late Victorian novel echoes of the detective fiction genre of Sherlock Holmes. We have clues set out before us. The reader becomes the detective. We see the journals, newspaper articles, the switching in time. There's a non-linear time frame in the novel that flashes backwards and forwards, allowing the reader to pick up the clues and detect for themselves. And this is in part influenced by Sherlock Holmes. We see the epistolary novel form, which is, a genre going back to the birth of the novel with Robinson Crusoe and diary entries. Journalistic extracts and telegrams echo the kind of modern technology. The ship's log, again, gives us the verisimilitude of fact, increasing the terror. The doctor's case notes echo the rise in scientific journals and the rise of science in the Victorian period. And this is also a curiously modern novel, even though it's a late Victorian novel. We have multiple narratives. We have, as I've said, a kind of non-linear time frame in which the novel jumps backwards and forwards. We use different extracts, different forms, intertextuality, metafiction. This is very much a modern novel, using postmodernist techniques in many ways. And so consider the literary context of the book that you're dealing with. This is probably a really important area that examiners are hoping for you to explore with specific examples. Now take 10 minutes to write up your notes, finding specific examples of how this book is influenced by other literary texts. Now, at this time, you should be somewhat of an expert on what makes a text a Gothic text and what are the conventions or the ingredients of Gothic. And you should, without much effort, be able to find examples of each of these in Dracula and in the Bloody Chamber. The interesting thing to consider is what makes the book Gothic, and can you range around the text showing what it is that's typically conventional with Gothic literature here, but also consider this is a late Victorian Gothic book. Where does this text subvert our expectations of Gothic? Where does it conform to it? Where does it follow the rules and break the rules? And why do you think that might be? Spend 10 minutes answering this question. Right. Clint Eastwood once famously said that um, opinions. No, I can't. Everybody. No, I'm going to finish that. Okay, let's consider the critical context or the reader's context. Now, books are never static. What the writer meant by them doesn't necessarily dictate what the reader understands by them. There's a famous idea about the idea of the death of the author. Once a text is created, the author's opinion of what the book is about doesn't really matter anymore. It's what the reader considers. And readers' opinions change over time based on the reader's context. And here's a brief summary of how different people have viewed the novel and the character of Count Dracula itself as an embodiment of the Freudian id, a response to the powerful new woman, says Carol Senft, while Christopher Kraft sees Dracula as embodying latent homosexuality. Stephen Arata interprets the events of the novel as an anxiety over colonialism and the end of empire, and the anxiety about racial mixing. Talia Schaffer construes the novel as an indictment of Oscar Wilde. She equates Dracula as the Wildean figure. Franco Moretti reads Dracula as a figure of capitalism. And Hollis Robbins suggests that Dracula's inability to participate in social conventions and to forge business partnerships undermined his power. It's interesting that those last two writers see the book as about economics and money and capitalism. If the Circle of Light were not rich, they would not have been able to travel at will across Europe to seek out Dracula and defeat him. So in a sense, capitalism and the money of the capitalist bourgeoisie are able to defeat this ancient Gothic monster. Without money, they wouldn't have been able to do it. And Dracula, in some sense, as this Eastern European outsider, is not able to successfully mingle into business, the social conventions of Britain, despite the fact he's a vampire and he can't do it anyway. Richard Knoll reads Dracula within the context of 19th century alienism, psychiatry, and asylum medicine. So different readers see the novel in different ways and they have a different focus for what they see the novel doing. Bruno Stars understands the novel to be a pro-Catholic pamphlet promoting proselytization. So that means really that the novel is really encouraging us all to become Catholics, because if we were to become Catholics, that would be some kind of defense against some alien invasion of vampire. And there's arguments for finding all of these evidence of these in the book. A good reader should be able to support different readings of the book that they're studying. However, the most important interpretation, AO5, but also AO3, the reader's context, is you. As a modern reader, you bring your own values and judgments and views of the world to the text that you read. So what do you think the book is really about? What do you, representing the modern reader in the 21st century, see this book to be about? What does it seem to be saying to you? So take around 10 minutes now to consider the reader's context, the readers over time. How have different people seen this book? And how do you see this book as a modern reader? What do you think this book is dealing with? Just returning again to the literary context, but specifically intertextuality and the influence of specific books let's consider some of the books that have been referenced, perhaps in Dracula, and where you might find specific intertextual references to other books. Of course, we've got the Mark of Cain with Mina. Texts often sort of delve into the Pandora story, the idea of this forbidden secret, opening this box and what happens when you do so. Consider how Jonathan sort of plays into that role, and we see that in the Bloody Chamber as well, don't we? Carmilla and the idea of a female vampire is explored, and we've talked about that a little earlier. We've talked about the influence, the pervasive influence of Poe on later urban Gothic and later Gothic fiction. The idea of setting the Gothic not in remote castles or Catholic countries, but rather in the cities, and exploring that the real terror is often a psychological terror. Consider where we see psychological terror in the book. Consider how the city itself can be seen as terrifying, but perhaps focusing on this notion of dreams and nightmares and insanity. These are stock areas of Poe, and consider where they were influenced by in Dracula. Journals and the influence and journals of Frankenstein and Captain Walton in Frankenstein. You can explore again how this novel takes sort of stock conventions of earlier Gothic novels. We've talked about Sherlock Holmes and late Victorian Gothic settings. So again, think about specific moments in the book that seem to remind you of other literary texts, to showcase how this book isn't made in isolation, but is drawing upon and reacting against literature that's come before it and is written in at that moment as well. 10 minutes. You've probably done quite a lot of working class on the social context and on society's influence on the book, and you've probably spent quite a lot of time looking at the fin de siècle, these end-of-century anxieties and fears that permeate and run through Dracula, and finding specific examples of them to pepper your answer would be good, would be an effective thing to do. And I'm not going to run through and list all of these, but you can read them yourself. But think about, where might we see examples of these? I think fear of drunkenness and the fear of the drunken working classes is something that we see in quite a lot of books in the late 19th century. And I think Dracula is quite interesting in the way it portrays the working classes. But could you be able to offer specific moments of how it portrays the working classes in the book? That is the challenge. Oscar Wilde does it also in The Picture of Dorian Gray. We often see the working classes reverting to drink. And again, is this, illustrating some kind of fear or anxiety in the writers of their times? So knowing about your fin de siècle, your end of century anxieties, is all very, very well, but can you spend 10 minutes finding specific illustrative examples in the book of these that you could quote in an essay? You've got 10 minutes to work on this. Okay, I'm going to end this presentation just talking about how do we embed this contextual information into our essays. 50% of our mark is based on looking at how texts are influenced by the production, the writing of the text, the reception of the text, and the reception over time of the text. You you need to be able to give specific, concise, contextual statements, and a range of them. I always say to history students, we don't need a history of the British Empire. We don't need a long paragraph about the biographical history of Bram Stoker. We don't need that. We don't need a long paragraph about a range of Gothic texts and how they are linked to Dracula. Avoid big chunks of context. Your focus is on the book, and the focus is on how contexts illuminate our understanding of the book. Okay, the focus isn't on the context itself. Does that make sense? So we don't need a long life story that doesn't relate to the text. We don't need the long history of Bram Stoker's life with Henry Irving, but we need to focus on the text. So let's consider some of this. Let's look at how this does it successfully. I'm going to read from this part here. Can you see the slide? The circle. As this is a postmodern text, Carter makes much use of mixing genres to highlight the patriarchal nature of fairy stories. Okay, in one sentence, we're showing the examiner A that we identify this text as a postmodern text, and B that one of the conventions of a postmodern text is mixing genres. And we see that she's using that. The purpose of her mixing genres is to highlight the patriarchal nature of fairy stories. Now, we would go on to give an illustrative example of how she mixes a genre, and also what she's highlighting about the patriarchy. But that would be for another sentence or follow-on sentences. Okay, but we're showing in one sentence knowledge of what postmodernism is concisely. Let's take the next one. Short stories often place importance on the ending, forcing the reader to interpret the meaning. The werewolf ends on a statement that does not tell the reader what to think. Quote, and so she prospered. Now this is again another concise thing. We're dealing with the literary context. Many students go into the exam and talk about the Bloody Chamber collection, and they don't deal with the idea that these are short stories. Short stories in their essence, in their genre, are different to novels. This candidate here is showing us immediately that short stories often place much more importance on the endings than novels do. And so this is a literary context that they're weighing up. And they take this context to then look at the end of the werewolf. And so she prospered. Okay. The reader in short stories is forced to interpret the meaning. We're not told. Okay. Short stories deal with showing, not telling. Carter doesn't tell us what to think, and so she prospered allows us to think, well, what are we supposed to make of this? What do we understand to be the meaning? So, again, it's a way of bringing the literary context of genre, the short story, to a specific point. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's take a biographical factor here. Carter lived in Japan for 2 years as an outsider and an outcast. Okay, so as a European, she felt kind of alone, an outsider, different. That's fine. Don't need any more than that. This is just one contextual piece of information in one sentence. We use a second sentence, a follow-on sentence, to link this in some way to the text. This informs her presentation of Wolf Alice, who is on a journey of self-discovery. We could add, as an outsider and as an outcast from society. We could say that Carter deals with outsiders and outcasts because she has been one herself. And then that would lead you into focusing on characters who are outsiders and outcasts. Here's another example of embedding concisely context. The snow child like her novel Wise Children, sees Carter unafraid to explore the nature of transgressions and taboos like incest. So here we've got just a subordinate clause, the snow child, like her novel Wise Children. We're showing the examiner very briefly that we're aware of the writer's other texts. Carter is, in Wise Children, Carter is unafraid to explore the nature of transgressions and taboos. Okay, so we're just in the same sentence, we're saying her novel deals with this X and Y. So does this book. And so you don't need any more than that. Okay, but you're peppering your answer with a variety of contexts in concise ways. Okay, that's it. I hope you found this useful, and I hope you're aware that, you know, in your end of unit assessments, bear in mind the importance of the weight that's placed on your ability to integrate contexts to explain why your books are the way they are. I hope this helps. Okay, good luck. And that's the